Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
Happy Friday, Food Junkies listeners. Did you know Food Junkies was a book before it was a podcast? Dr. Vera Tarman's book is available in audio and paperback. Be sure to get your copy today. Bring it with you when you join us in Toronto in October. To find out more about our in-person meetup, check the show notes. Also be sure to join Vera's Facebook group, I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar-Free for Life Support.
Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your host today. Today, we're speaking with best-selling author Marc Lewis. Marc Lewis is a neuroscientist and professor of developmental psychology, most recently working at Radboud University of Netherlands. He is author and co-author of over 50 journal publications in psychology and neuroscience. He is author of 2 books that are staples in the addiction field, Memoir of the Addicted Brain or of an Addicted Brain, and The Biology of Desire. In Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, Marc shares his personal and clinical experience of addictions. Biology of Desire explores further the neurochemistry of addiction. These books, if you haven't read them yet, are fascinating must-reads for anyone who wants an insider view of the brain on drugs, what it feels like, and what is happening neurologically. Now, Marc is back in Toronto now working as a clinical psychologist. We at Food Junkies Podcast are interested in learning how Marc's understanding of addiction can help us approach food addiction differently. Can it be viewed as a behavioral issue rather than just as the result of a chronic progressive brain malfunction, which is how we're seeing it right now? So before we get into the discussion, hello, Marc.
Hello, Vera. Nice to see you again.
Yes, it's great to see you again. And thank you so much for coming here all the way from wherever you are in Toronto. I'm in Toronto too.
All the way from my basement. Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, so you yourself are quite open in your memoirs book. So we always start with a bit of the personal. So would you be willing to tell us a little bit about how you got into the field of addictions, how you started off as a researcher in neuroscience, and then I'm assuming, because I read the book, how that morphed into your own personal story of addiction and then into your studies in developmental psychology? Just a little bit.
Okay, well, the years of addiction were in my 20s, pretty much throughout my 20s, mostly pharmaceutical opiates. And I finally got off them at around the age of 30, 31. And then I got back into school, having been unceremoniously kicked out of a graduate psychology program for breaking into a drugstore. Got back in, got a PhD, became a professor in developmental psychology. So that was the first step for me. And then went from developmental psychology to more developmental neuroscience, what's going on in the brain as kids develop, especially when we're looking at particular kinds of behaviors, anxiety, depression, trauma-induced issues, and any other kinds of problem behaviors that tend to mess up people's lifespan. And so from there, I kind of got tired of the academic just mode of expression because it's very, very particular, very formalistic, and doesn't reach a lot of people who it needs to reach. So I decided to write a book, or pop psychology, a layperson's book. And at the time, my partner said, I was thinking of, well, what should I write it about? I want it to be about the brain. And I want it to be about, how the brain functions and development and stuff. Why don't you write about your years of addiction? Because that was pretty fascinating and certainly a developmental story.
It sure was, yeah.
So that's how I got into it. I wrote that book about my years of addiction. And with each chapter, there's kind of some dramatic or horrible event interspersed with what's going on in the brain with respect to different drugs.
Yeah. I have to say that I read both of your books and I found them fascinating, like page turning. If you haven't read them, people, please read them. And the thing that you're saying, you're absolutely right that an academic article does not read well. You have to really plow through and push yourself through. And I don't know how you went from that kind of mode of writing to your ability. I mean, I'm assuming you didn't have a ghostwriter. You really knew how to write that book. Both of those books are fascinating reads.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a good editor who often would say, hey, you're going to tell a story. This is nonfiction, but you're going to tell a story. Tell the whole story. Don't hold back. Tell what it felt like, what really happened, how bad it was, and so forth. That kind of guidance and mentoring was very useful for me.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I mean, it takes more than just a good editor, although a good editor is worth their salt and gold, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And, in academic writing, you hold back on anything that is subjective or,
yes,
vocational. Right. This was kind of the opposite. And I love this kind of writing. To me, it's really fun. It's a lot more fun than the other.
I am going to ask you in a little while what's next, but are you planning on doing another writing like that, book like that?
Yeah. I've got a proposal that I worked very hard sitting in my agent's office, hopefully in the middle of his desk, that we're hoping that a publisher will pick it up soon.
Okay, if you're willing to talk about that later, I'll ask you, but you may want to keep that to yourself. I appreciate that. But okay, so you decided to write this thing, and then that's how I actually got to know you. But then all of a sudden I heard that you went to the Netherlands. So how did that happen?
Yeah, that was just, we had 2 4-year-olds at the time, my wife and I, 4-year-old twins, and she had a research position. I was a full prof at U of T. I wanted to be less involved in academia and get more into the popular science domain. She wanted to be more involved. We got a package deal at university, Radboud, which some people know as Nijmegen. Nijmegen is the city. And it seemed like a great place to go with young kids. It's a nice environment to raise kids. We just ended up staying. We ended up staying for 10 years because it was a good place to be. And then we came back to Toronto.
Yeah, and now you're in Toronto.
Yeah, so by then the boys were kind of bored of, essentially not a big city. We weren't in Amsterdam, and they visited Toronto enough times to be intrigued to go back there, to try living there.
Okay, just out of curiosity, you now are working as a clinical psychologist in Toronto. Are you working with addictions or not necessarily?
The door's open. I see whoever comes. I'm in a practice with 4 or 5 other people. Okay. About 40% of my clients have addiction issues at the top of the chart, at the top of their profile. Others, anxiety, PTSD, depression, lots of depression. And of course, all of these things are interlinked as we go.
Okay. Well, as I said, I know you from your 2 books and from your understanding about addiction, and that's particularly what we're interested in at Food Junkies. So your first book, Memoir of an Addicted Brain, as I said, it's a vivid account of the addict mind, a blending of Marc's life story with a user-friendly account of how drugs affect the brain and create addiction. And then Biology of Desire picks up that concept of your view of addiction. So if you don't mind just explaining in a nutshell, you've talked about addiction as a learned, I guess there's this distinction that the traditional medical model sees addiction as a disease process, a chronic progressive disease. And you're offering, not just you, but there's a few of you that are offering, no, it's something else. So do you want to elaborate on that, the sort of behavioral understanding of that?
Yeah, there's quite a few of us now. I think that the balance is tilting in this direction. Even NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I looked at their website for over the last 5 years, their postings. I could not find the word disease. It just, now they call it a disorder.
Yes.
And there's a lot of problems with the word disease, but one of them is just simply, a semantic, definitional. What does it mean? What does it mean to say addiction is a disease? There's so much misuse of the term, and it can be destructive to tell someone they've got a chronic disease. Tough luck, Charlie. You better just watch yourself for the rest of your life. So there are clinical implications that are not desirable. So, a number of us have focused a lot more on environmental circumstances, developmental issues, parenting, early abuse and neglect, stuff like that. And I think that's an important precursor and predictor of addiction to substances or alcohol or food or sex or porn or, a few other things or, just gaming, because they usually lead to depression and anxiety, which is hard to regulate. And when negative feelings are hard to regulate, people will find whatever works. I mean, that's sort of my general overview.
Okay. Now, how is that different than you said that they're not using the word? Well, first of all, are you okay with the word disorder?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So
I have a bit on that one.
Well, what would you prefer to use?
I think disorder is okay, but I think addiction is so complex and so much a part of the personality that I'm sometimes hesitant to brand it, to give it its own category. It is a type of thing, a type of disorder. Is it, or is it just, certain kinds of life paths include addictive elements, which sounds a little bit different than a disorder. So I'm not entirely happy with that.
Would you agree with, so if I'm using, I'm fine with the word disorder too, but really what I'm just wondering is, if I were to diagnose somebody with a, quote, disease or disorder, I'm going to look for the criteria, the substance use disorder. Is this person, obsessively craving for something? Are they using despite negative consequences? Do they struggle? Do you agree with those criteria?
Yeah, more or less. I don't use DSM in any meaningful way. I sometimes as a clinical psychologist from North America, I need to use the labels, but they're not very helpful for me personally. But yeah, we both recognize there are people whose lives are, torn apart by addictions of various kinds. And sure, when that happens and when you're constantly bumping up against, all kinds of societal norms, you're losing friends, you're losing family, you're losing health, you're losing your life, you're losing money. And yeah, a disorder makes a lot of sense because of the friction between what you're doing and how other people are living their lives.
Okay, so I guess we can agree on that. I don't know if we're necessarily disagreeing, but from that model of disease versus disorder, I want to sort of flesh that out a little bit, because a lot of people, well, first of all, so with the disease model that I'm operating by, it's the concept is there's a dopamine overkill, basically an overabundance, and then the brain has to readjust it through neuroadaptation, downregulation of receptors, etc. And that starts a process, a physiological process that's not just developmental or biological. There's actually something that's happening in the brain that you could make the argument this is a chronic progressive condition that is neurological. Are you with me on that one or no?
No.
Okay, elaborate. So give me your perspective, because that would help me explain. Let me just think that would help me explain why somebody who says I can have I can't have anything because that'll trigger the dopamine, and then the craving will start and the whole phenomena will start. But if you're not buying that model, then how would you explain why somebody is obsessed and then just uses despite adverse consequences?
So the dopamine system, the mesolimbic dopamine system, is very much misunderstood.
Okay.
It's involved in a lot of things. It's involved in addiction and love and gambling and craving and, sports a lot. It's really important. I just read something by Kenneth Bloom, the guy who developed the, quote, reward deficiency syndrome. And there's utter, claptrap. It's just like, people still talk about dopamine as a pleasure chemical. It's not. Yeah. Dopamine focuses and narrows attention on a goal and induces pursuit of the goal, which in the case of addiction, we often call craving. And as anyone knows, who's been there, craving is not pleasure. So the dopamine system's involved. But I think the more important neural components, what's going on. And by the way, I don't think you can talk about anything neural without talking about developmental processes. The brain is always changing. It's plastic. It modifies itself according to experience. So it's always developmental. Even in your 80s, there's stuff changing, right? Okay. So I put those together. But I think that narrowing of the range of potential rewards is one way to think about addiction that is consistent with a brain picture, because, in the brain we have this thing called predictive coding. The brain is thinking ahead and focusing on what it's interested in, so to speak, what's familiar, what's rewarding, what's interesting. So, of course, if you've been using cocaine or heroin or chocolate chip cookies for 5 years, regulate your emotions, that's where you're going to go. And because the brain continues to build synaptic networks, networks of connected neurons.
And so just for our listeners, meaning therefore then that if I'm feeling in distress, I can anticipate relief from that distress, and I'm going to go there because of this neurological thing.
That's what the brain does. It's not only survival, it's the way mammals operate. You have to focus on what's going to be good for you, or what you think is going to be good for you.
Okay.
Right. So, you could just say simply that a lot of attention gets devoted to a narrow range of possible regulating substances or processes, whether it's sex, food, or drugs. It's narrow. And guess what? At the same time, of course, the social world narrows. I'm very interested in that strange, shall we say, parallel as the attention stream and the brain, the actual synaptic networks that you might say are associated with feeling better. As that becomes more and more constrained, so does your social world. It gets smaller and smaller, and you don't talk to your cousins or your kids or your partner anymore. You just talk to other addicts or your dealer. It's kind of a very yucky process from both perspectives.
Can I conclude then what you're saying is that the problem with somebody who's addicted to too much sugar or drug or something is that their options to deal with their distress are so narrow that that's the number one solution. And therefore therapy would be, let's open up those options to other options.
Yes, I would agree with that. That's certainly going to be a big part of the therapy. Can be.
Okay. And so if somebody were to say, but I can't think of anything else because I'm obsessed about this, it's not because there's a dopamine hypersensitivity, like an allergic response, as it were. It's actually more, they don't have another option.
It's both.
Okay.
So to be more precise, there are processes in the part of the brain called the striatum, which is involved in motivation and action and wanting, craving, and all that. There are processes where some cells become wired together in a more compulsive pattern of behavior, and it's the simplest way to think of it is the ventral striatum. Ventral means the south pole versus the dorsal striatum, the north pole.
Yes.
Up the top and bottom, so to speak. And it's really interesting research, mostly by a guy named Robbins at Cambridge, that shows that the more people use a particular substance or method to relieve their emotions, the more focused and concentrated, the more activation shifts from the ventral up to the dorsal. So what does that mean? That means a slightly different part of the brain starts to become involved in behavioral choices, and they become more rapid and, as you say, and more automatic.
Yes.
So you're now you're acting before, and it's very much like OCD. It's very much stimulus response, right? So there is something unique and special going on in the brain. I don't deny that. It's special, it's important, and it's an important way to think about addiction because it helps us understand why it's so hard to quit.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, it sounds definitely, it's far more complicated than just the dopamine response, the initial response. Yeah. Okay.
Like the initial response is the dopamine gets sent up from the midbrain, gets fired, and then it lands somewhere. And there's all kinds of neurons all over the brain, different parts of the brain where it lands, different types of receptors. So that's what complicates the story in a lot of ways. And and just to build on that idea, like for a lot of people, the excitement, uncertainty, even danger of acquiring drugs, substances can be a big part of the experience. Like that's the case in gambling, actually. If you win too often in gambling, the dopamine levels go down if you win too much. And if you lose too much, it goes down. You get the maximum dopamine levels when you have maximum uncertainty. So
Right. I'm just wondering how I could relate that to food. So the person, the first piece, which is I feel distressed, I'm going to have ice cream to just feel better. But then I suppose you could say what you're saying right now is, okay, if the person has a lot of ice cream, even when you're eating, it's not satisfying. Like the person is still wanting, even while they're eating, they're wanting something else. I guess it's looking for that, not necessarily uncertainty, but the new, something else new.
I think that's right. Yeah. So if you've got a freezer full of ice cream, container after full of ice cream, it's going to be less attractive, less compelling. Yeah.
Right. And that makes me think, I wouldn't have thought of this, but that makes me think, could that explain partly why people are successful with maybe abstaining and then they lose it? Like why is it that could it be an explanation for relapse, to reintroduce that level of uncertainty, crisis, anxiety when everything is steady state otherwise? Could we understand?
Yeah, I think so. I think relapse is also very complex, but sometimes people feel I'm okay now. I can play around with this. You and I have talked about that, right? And sometimes they really can't play around with it without falling back into a very habitual routine that can mess up their lives. in a serious way. But so part of that is it becomes different, becomes more novel. It's like, I wonder what that would feel like now. I haven't done it in 2 years. kinds of stuff there.
Okay. My next question, which I have to ask you, is the concept of abstinence. So in the disease model, you recognize that something is broken, and we don't want to go back to that disrepair. So we have to abstain. So in the model that you're using, which is that it's a much more complex dopaminergic, may fire off with the dopamine, but then I guess I like that concept of autonomic thoughts develop. So would you, based even on that thinking, would you make the argument that in some cases people do have to be abstinent?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think with respect to alcohol, there's a guy, what's his name? James, will come to me. He's a really serious alcohol researcher in the UK who also acknowledges publicly that he had an alcohol use problem for a long time, abstained for several years, and then successfully got back to social drinking. Many people don't successfully get back to social drinking, and he knows that. And one of the big dangers and, kind of loopholes is that you don't really know unless you really know yourself and really know how that substance is integrated into your own attachment system. So it's kind of trial and error, and it can go wrong and it can fuck up your life.
Yeah.
So that's the problem.
How would you explain a person who cannot abstain versus one that can, if you're not using sort of dopamine, the want switch is broken concept of sort of typical version of addiction, where there's a dopaminergic hypersensitivity that is now forever hypersensitive. Like I often say to people, it's kind of like once you're diabetic, you're always a diabetic because your insulin receptor, the resistance it's not robust enough to go back to square one. And I say that's the same as a dopaminergic thing. But you're probably thinking that's not the case. Tell me what your perspective is. Why could somebody?
It's not a bad metaphor in some ways. It's not. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but in some ways, your thinking has become mismanaged so much, so to speak, that you fall back into bad habits really quickly. Well, how I think about that is I think about it much more in terms of deeper psychological processes, especially self-blame, self-accusation, shame, and defiance. Like as you and I have talked about a bit. In my psychological practice, I follow a model called internal family systems.
Okay.
And the internal family is up here. It's the voices that we all hear in our head sometimes.
He's pointing to his brain here, folks.
Into my head. I've got them too, and most people will acknowledge an internal critic. That's almost part of the common language now.
Yeah.
My critic, is scolding me. I shouldn't have done that. Okay, well, there's that, but there's also maybe an internal part of you that is defiant and that says, I don't want to listen to you. I hate you. I want to be free. I'm tired of following the rules. When I think of addiction as a pattern that becomes self-perpetuating and really difficult to stop, it's because those two internal voices start to feed each other and it's a polarization that's self-reinforcing. You get more and more strict with yourself, more and more punitive and shaming. Oh, you did it again, you asshole. I can't believe you did it again. How are you going to explain it to your wife or whatever, your kids? So that internal critic, the more powerful it gets, the more powerful gets the other part that says, I don't want to listen to you. I'm getting out of here. You make me feel really bad. And I know one way to feel better, and that's where I'm going. See you later.
Okay. And if I wanted to tie that to the biology, what we've already discussed, is that in a way challenging that those set autonomic patterns that have been developed sort of in the other part of the brain? Like
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think about that a lot. And that is what I think my next book will be about.
Oh, wow.
Because it's mysterious. It's not so simple, right? Like, I think the self-critical voice starts to develop around the age of 4, 5, 6. You're scolded by your parents for this and that, and then you start scolding yourself.
Yeah, and just to make this relevant to people listening, this is like the person who's trying to be on a diet and they relapsed again and they're hating themselves because they're overweight, they're diabetic, and their doctor's going to yell at them, right? And there's that other part that's saying, but I want that thing. I want that food. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So the other part, well, what's that? That's also comes from a young age that, when I was like 4 or 5 and my mom got really mad at me and I got spanked and stuff, I would either come down and try to be a good boy. I'll be better. I won't do it again. Yeah. Or I would run down the block and go into the ravine and hang out in the ravine for a while because I just wanted to be free. And when I became an addict, so to speak, I don't use that word quite that way, but it was pretty much the same two parts of me, the scoldy part and the part that said, I want to have fun. I want to be free. It's not just fun. It's like authenticity. It feels like real me.
So that's interesting. So your therapeutic approach then, because here you are, you're wanting to give options, right? So what would you do in that case? Person is saying, I can't stop eating, and I don't want you to tell me to stop. I can't restrict.
Right.
Yes. What would you do?
Yeah. So people try to connect this with the neuroscience, the neurobiology of it, and it's not so easy, but I think we'll get there eventually. But for now, what would you do? Okay, clinically. Good question. In IFS, internal family systems, what they do is very different from a rehab setting.
Setting, we would just scold.
Yeah.
Scold or medicate the defiant self to submission, basically.
Exactly. So, yes. So in IFS, internal family systems, it's almost the opposite. You make friends with both voices. You talk with them. You listen to them. Why are you so mad at me? Oh, because of that. Yeah. You must be really mad because I did it again last night and I stole the money from my mother's wallet or whatever. And okay, you're really hating me for that, aren't you? Yes. Okay, well, I know that wasn't a very good thing to do. And I know why you're mad. And I know you are always trying to keep me good and make sure I don't do that again. And geez, that must be a lot of work for you. And you actually talk with these voices. And it's kind of magical form of therapy. I found it really effective.
Do you think it would have helped you when you were 21 years old? If somebody had said, I remember you had the story of being in that lab with mice or something like that. And if somebody had said, hey, what are you doing? You're going to lose your PhD. And then, what's going on? Do you think you would have had a different reaction?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I use this technique with people from age, 17 through 70. And anyway, so you're talking to the critical part, but you're also talking to that rebel defiant part.
Yes.
And you're saying, like, I've been dealing with a fentanyl addict the last little while, and he got clean for 6 months. And I think it was entirely through the IFS therapy that he was able to do that. Then he relapsed. Okay. And then, so we got back into it, got the voices back in focus, got the, like a lot of, like, I think you can generally agree that when people relapse, they sort of forget how to regulate themselves and how to control themselves, how to slow down and think about things.
Because they're in such full of shame.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah. But because they haven't really dealt with the inner problem. They stopped using for 3 months or 6 months, but there's still a little kid in there who's scared and ashamed and feels crappy. And so that when the opportunity comes up, they go for it. Right. So Vera, just to finish that point,
please do.
And I think this does apply to people with eating disorders as well. When you talk to the rebellious, defiant part and listen to it, and it's strange at first, as it uses guided imagery, you kind of get and think about that part and move back from it so you can address it and say, okay, what's going on with you? Why do you feel you need to do this right now? Because I'm bored. Okay, you're bored, really? What does bored feel like? Well, it feels not just bored. It feels like something bad's going to happen. Okay, so something bad's going to happen. And if you eat a whole bunch of ice cream right now, or, contact your opiate dealer, how's that going to help? Well, then I'm going to feel free of it. I'm going to feel like, okay, I don't have to deal with that right now. I'm a free agent, and to hell with everybody else and their rules and stuff. I feel better. And okay, you feel better, but let's think about what you're doing. And let's think about how much better do you actually feel? And how long does that last?
Yes, not long at all.
Not long at all. So you start the dialoguing with the voices that are already there, and they start to change. They start to free up and relax and become, so to speak, more sensible, more part of you rather than just this, kind of isolated, freakish mechanisms that are so automatic.
Okay, so what would you do then in a circumstance like addiction is a classic, taking the perspective that sometimes addiction is a reasonable response to an unreasonable world. So, right. I guess like Gabor Mate's thing that this is a response to trauma. I mean, we're living in a circumstance where we can't change traumatic past, and they continue to develop in kids as we see it. And in the food world, So people respond, instead of drugs, they use food. And then they're living in an environment where there's no acknowledgement that food is a problem. So in fact, it's encouraged. So how can you get out of that mess when your environment is working against you right from the get-go and then onwards?
So the environment is a mess in all kinds of ways. From a particular family with particular problems, maybe some of them might be genetically linked, but a lot of them are just plain, let's just say, bad parenting, right? Or isolating, shaming kind of parenting. And you can't get rid of that. You're right. You can't get rid of that. You also can't get rid of racism and poverty and sexism and the other things that might be making you feel bad. So what do?
And you can't get rid of the supermarkets that are in your face all the time with all of their goodies.
So that's, which is kind of interesting difference, I guess, between the use of illegal substances, for example, and the use of food. And nowadays, cannabis is a really interesting kind of middle ground.
Yeah.
It's become legalized. So what's that about? Some people, well, anyway, there's lots we could talk about. But
that's a very interesting subject.
Yeah, it is. But the availability is a problem. The things that make you feel uncomfortable and bad in your own skin, that's a problem. You can't do much about either of those things. All you can really do is change the way you are talking with yourself, change what that feels like. And in IFS, they have a concept of what they call self, capital S, self.
Okay.
That's really just your own heart, your own essence, your self-care. I think it would be a good synonym. It's the feeling of, I care about you, I want to take care of you, I want to help you. When you say that to your own addictive parts, they start to settle down. They feel, I don't care if the shelves are full of food. I don't really need that right now because I feel loved from inside. And it changes the whole system.
Hey, Food Junkies listeners. We're just going to take a quick break here to share with you something our team thinks could help benefit your recovery with food, body, or self. Thank you again for listening.
Sweet Sobriety has 2 amazing workshops in the month of July. Be sure to join Molly Pinkshop, licensed clinical professional counselor and licensed addiction counselor, on Fridays as she covers codependency, from codependent to interdependent. This workshop may be for you if you have low self-esteem, familial dysfunction, depression, anxiety, stress, low emotional expressivity, having a hard time saying no, having poor boundaries, showing emotional reactivity, feeling compelled to take care of people, having a need for control, especially over others, having trouble communicating honestly, fixating on mistakes, feeling a need to be liked by everyone, feeling a need to be always in a relationship, denying one's own needs, thoughts, and feelings, having intimacy issues, confusing love and pity, displaying fear of abandonment. This workshop will identify what codependency is and isn't. It'll help you identify why codependency and addiction go hand in hand. It'll explain how codependency affects recovery. It'll teach you how to recognize the signs as an individual and in relationships if codependency is an issue. It'll help you identify your attachment style and how you can shift it. It'll help teach you how to prevent codependent relationships from developing, and it'll support you in working toward interdependence and independence. What you'll get are pre-recorded videos to watch at your own pace, downloads, worksheets, and resources, and 4 one-hour live sessions that will be recorded and available for replay. Join us Fridays, July 7th, 14th, 21st, 28th at 12 p.m. Pacific or 3 p.m. Eastern or 8 p.m. UK in July. The workshop is $50 US. And I also wanted to let you know that we are running a free Foundations workshop for anyone who has purchased the Foundations course. This is a work at your own pace course of $200 US. And we will meet on Wednesdays, July 5th, 12th, 19th, and 26th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. UK. And we'll cover 3 modules each week. Be sure to check the show notes for the links.
Now back to the show. If you have enjoyed this episode, please let us know. We love to hear from you. Kindly leave us a review on whatever platform you listen to our podcast on. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
All right. Now, something you said a little earlier that I want to bring out, and I think it is a point where we may disagree. You and I don't know. We'll see. And you talked about in one podcast that I heard the concept of choice and empowerment. And then you had said about how people, get deflated if they hear they have a disease. What's the point? And so what I want to pose to you is, what do you say when people will say, thank you for telling me I have a food addiction or an addiction. That explains that, therefore, my willpower, which I just feel terrible about because I don't have any willpower, and now I can explain why. Because I have a disease, I have a problem, and now you're going to give me tools. But if I'm told that I have the ability to make a choice and have empowerment, how am I not going to feel bad? So what's your take on that concept of choice and empowerment in the face of somebody who is not being able to choose?
So that's obviously a really central issue right there.
Yes. But please, let's flush that one out.
So choice is such a complicated thing, right? Choice is weird. I mean, you can choose to drive by your normal route home by the liquor store, or you can go one block over. And if you go one block over and you don't pass the liquor store, then your chances of not getting drunk that night are going to be a lot better. So you're making a choice at some point in that cascade, but maybe, not at the point of having the bottle to your lips. So choice is something that we do with the cognitive parts of our brain. We think ahead. Choice is usually about thinking ahead.
Yes.
When choice is more compulsive, like we've been talking about, it's a different animal. It doesn't really feel like choice anymore. It feels like a push from behiund. Yeah.
Okay, but you don't want to call that disease. You would rather call that.
So what you said.
Yeah, go ahead.
What you said about thank you for telling me I have a disease. Thank you, because now I don't feel so what? Don't feel so what? I think the word I would put in there is shame, and you might agree with me, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't feel so ashamed. So that's good. It's good to feel less ashamed because shame is toxic. Shame is horrible. So if that works, and I even use that, even though I don't call it a disease, I will say, this is really hard for you to stop, isn't it? And we can think about the brain and we can think about neural pathways, but we can also just think about habits. I mean, you got people that have habits. Like, how much added value do you get by going, from outside the skin to inside the skull and saying, okay, this is a brain habit rather than a behavior habit? You might get a little extra traction there, but maybe not so much. But one way or another, helping people say, I understand, I get how you feel pushed, how you feel like there's no choice, how automatic this feeling and decision becomes for you. I really get it. And I don't want you to feel terrible about that, because that's what happens sometimes. And we're going to work with that.
Because they'll use words like, they'll say, I really like step one. I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol, food, sex, and that my life has become unmanageable. That is a huge relief for people. And so what would your step one be then, I guess, as an alternative, just so I can understand the alternative way?
Yeah. Okay. My step one. And by the way, I don't subscribe to AA per se, but I know it helps quite a number of people. And I certainly I'm not an AA basher by any means. Sometimes I even, suggest it for people. But my first step as a psychotherapist would be just, first of all, to say, I'm not going to judge you. I don't judge. And if you're using or not using on a given day or a given week, it's really okay. I'm not going to feel angry or disappointed. I just want to be there with you and help you figure it out. That would be my first step.
Okay. And then about the choice. Well, one day, what would you say about choice?
Well, so, this probably is a place where we disagree. I don't generally focus on the substance use itself as the focal point in therapy.
It's just a consequence of something else.
Yeah, I focus on the underlying stuff.
Okay.
And then I just got a guy, this week who finally gave up smoking cannabis all day long, came into the office just bright as a tack and happy and proud and sitting upright. We never talked about cannabis. We just never talked about it.
Wow.
It just stopped because he felt more inside himself and comfortable.
So you would be somebody then, like a lot of people will say, I don't want to see you in my office unless you're clean of that substance. Because if your face is in the food or in the drug or in the whatever, you're still high or you're still focused on that substance. This is how a lot of us think. You don't.
I think that's idiotic. I really do. I mean, if I come to you with an addiction problem and say, I don't want to see you till you no longer have an addiction problem, what the hell?
But what about, is your frontal lobe, do you have the clarity of mind to be able to do all the necessary things like rationalize, forgive, all the things that are required?
Well, you know this phrase, addiction, hijacking the brain.
Yes, yeah.
It's an extreme exaggeration. It does not hijack the brain. Even when I was using really powerful opiates and stuff, I was still going to university and, getting good grades for years. And I was able to do that. My brain was not absent.
Okay.
But I had a problem for sure. But Vera, one thing I just to clarify is, although this may sound more permissive or different, I'm not, talking about the substance use or the food use itself. Uh-huh. If people are in extreme, urgent situations where their use of whatever is really endangering them and they're about to dive, one way or another, I will talk about it. I will say, let's think about a way. Then I will resort more to sort of a cognitive behavioral type approach, less deep focus, more like, what are we going to do about this situation today?
Yeah, because today is imperative. You might not be here tomorrow. Your rent will be gone, or you'll be dead or something. Okay, all right. Now, another thing that you say somewhere, which is along the lines of the deeper way of thinking, is a person needs to look at their goals and perspectives, larger goals, and can they be changed in some way to support a better lifestyle? I mean, do you believe it's possible that somebody can continue to use with a better, improve their life, then now they can pay their rent? Is sobriety necessary? Or are you totally harm reduction in the sense that if it reduces harm, I'm good with that? And then ultimately, do you think that you can cure addiction using your approach?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You can literally walk away from the compulsivity of it. Yeah. At some point.
Yes. Like the guy I just told you about.
Yeah. Okay. So that would mean that if somebody were saying, I want to put this to sugar addiction, that if a person got to the heart of whatever problems that they're dealing with using your approach or something like that, that they might be able to have sugar gain. Yeah. Or a substance, a cigarette.
The main point is just that if the drive starts to go down, 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 you lose interest in the thing. I don't feel like doing that. It feels boring. I've always done that. I just don't feel like it anymore because there's a whole lot less shame because the system has opened up and there's love and self-compassion in there. And that means the motivation itself has shifted in a really fundamental way. There's not as much reason to use. It just isn't.
Okay. Well, I have to say that I can agree with you. And if I think about it in the context of people who have been sober, I'm talking food now, for a long time, will say, I don't want the sweet, the desserts, the Timbits or whatever it is that's there anymore because I don't want to feel sick. I don't want to feel like that craving anymore to use. I just want to walk by. And they're not driven by a superstitious fear that if I have one little piece, I'll fall apart. It's just they're choosing not to. So, I guess that's along the lines of what you're saying.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. And there's probably be loopholes and dangers. Yeah. It takes to change habits. Yeah. And by the way, just one more thing. I was going to say what you said about changing long-term plans and goals. We often talk about that as choosing sobriety or that. But this guy who stopped smoking cannabis all day long, he made another kind of choice. He wanted a future as in finance, in the world of finance and making money for other people who made money, all about making money. Yeah. It just wasn't him, and I could tell. And he finally, one day, came in and said, I'm not going to do that. I'm changing my goals entirely. I want to be I won't say exactly, but a very different career. And he looked so happy and proud and together. So those things came together. It was changing sort of goals and the narrative of the self, the life that I want to lead. But it gets to the addiction part, through the side door, kind of.
Okay. All right. Okay, good. Thank you. So now I have another question that pulls me back to, I guess, the disease model. And that is that there are some experiences like post-traumatic stress, for example. So something terrible happened one time, and it will now wake me up in the middle of the night. It will now be intrusive thoughts throughout the day. I have to have hypervigilance. Basically, that to me is a version of addiction when a person is in extreme addiction. Can you see the analogy there? A person uses a substance, and that's a powerful experience that is imprinted in, the memory. We always remember extreme reactions, and Addiction is an extreme reaction. How can we forget? That would be like telling a person who has post-traumatic stress, you know what, you can choose not to have that experience. But they're going to say, no, I can't. This hounds me and I can't control it. Now, what do you say to that?
So what I'm hearing you say, yeah, they're both intense experiences, but one is fundamentally awful and the other is about relief. So they're really different in terms of content.
Except that a person with who's eating and they're beyond, like their end stage, what I would say end stage addiction, there's no more relief. It's a relentless drive to, I guess, seek relief. You're right, but they don't get the relief.
Right.
It's definitely a seeking relief. Yeah. So there's the dopamine anticipation. Finally, this will stop.
I think you're right to think of those two as parallels in the sense that they both become strong neural habits.
Yes.
Habits of mind, habits of brain. Yes. I think you're reliving something awful over and over again. It occupies more and more territory up here, all over your brain. And same when you're spending your whole day thinking about, getting some Coke. Or am I going to wait till tomorrow? Or am I going to call my dealer tonight? Or, it's occupying a lot of space. It comes along like that really fast before you have a chance to think yourself.
Can you cure using your model? Can you see yourself getting out of that grip? If addiction is like post-traumatic stress, or is it that person might be, I don't want to say doomed, but altered, permanently altered?
Well, that is, you kind of stumbled right into it. It does sound like doom, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does.
So, my technique, so to speak, it's not exactly a good therapeutic model. I'm still feeling it out as I use IFS, but I use my version of it. The approach is that these habits and rapid choices, almost involuntary choices to take the thing it's so wrapped up in shame and self-anger and other anger. And those emotions are so powerful. They're so sudden that if you start working on the emotional stuff, it disempowers those impulses. It makes them slow. It slows them down. Well, once you slow them down, you have a chance to get in there. Right.
And then it might not be quite so much of a negative reaction or a strong reaction. I don't know what another word is.
Yeah, no, you can literally get in there, slow it down, and make it less, urgent. And when you make it less urgent, then you have a chance to think, I don't really want to feel like that. It's just not going to happen.
Right. And that's where, because you used the word spontaneous recovery, which really struck me as wow. So is that where, like your fellow with the cannabis, that strikes me as an example of spontaneous recovery, wouldn't you say?
Pretty much. I would like to say it's also a function of you have to be a therapist.
Right. I'm sorry. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. I think you meant it in the context of just a person decides, I don't really want to do this anymore.
It does not depend on therapy. It can go either way. But, a lot of people are drinking a lot in their 20s, binge drinking especially. And the statistics show that a lot of that stops by the end of the 20s, early 30s, because the whole life context changes and their self-concept changes. Well, that would be more what I would think of as spontaneous recovery.
Okay. And just to bring this back to food addiction, I don't know how much you know about the world of food addiction, but we're spending a lot of time trying to say, hey, this is as strong, as compelling, as damaging as certainly tobacco addiction, no question about that, but even something as compelling as alcohol or cocaine addiction.
Okay.
It has to be taken seriously that way. And then to help people who are saying, I just feel so full of shame. So what, Marc, can you suggest that we do, especially since you may not agree with that approach, but what would you say that we can do to add to our tools as we work with people and also try to make our way in the professional world?
Right. I know eating disorders and food problems can be very serious. In fact, Nora Volkow, the person, right, they had her NIDA forever. She studied binge eating disorder, right, and saw actually parallel neural changes in people to that and substance use, people with long-term substance addictions. So I have no doubt that it could be serious and really deep and really, really hard to change. So, what should we do?
What can you add to what we're already doing, which is trying to stake our ground that this is a serious condition, and and people are using internal family systems. They're using, what is a contingency? There's the CBT, DBT. They're using a number of things to help. Just what happened?
Yeah.
Give us some tools that we can add into the pile.
Okay, well, internal family system is a very specific focus where you actually look at the different parts of yourself, 4 or 5 different parts, and then you care for them, you help them, you calm them down, you love them, and they feel different. All those other approaches, CBT, DBT, and they're a little more superficial, more cognitive and stuff. They're not, I mean, they often help. I'm not saying they're bad. They're just different. I'm not sure how to approach your question because I did work with someone with a serious binge eating problem, bulimia, for about 1.5 years. Boy, it was so entrenched. It was really difficult for her to stop.
Entrenched is a good word, isn't it? That's,
I know. And so, I'm not an AA type person. I don't use that. But so what do? We went to a lot of stuff, and she got to a place where she found so much internal anger that was like this part of her that was like, just like roiled up and ready to like a raging beast ready to come out of her. So we tried to deal with it that way. Yeah. But frankly, that really it took a long time, and it wasn't that effective. And finally I ended up saying things like, I think you should go somewhere, go to a resort for 3 weeks so you'd be out of your environment and go to, and you won't be at the same grocery store. She was buying the same food every day.
When you talk about entrenched, hear my thought here. That thing about food is it's very primal. It's like one of our first pleasures is, maternal connection, maternal gaze while we're, taking in this highly sweet, fatty substance, which is breast milk. So there's a real primalness. And when that is distorted, talk about developmental psychology going wrong right from day one. And how would you fix something like that? I mean, I'm not asking you for a solution here. I'm more or less saying this is why it's so entrenched, because it's...
So I think in this respect, you and I are seeing it in this very similar way. I think you're right. I think my IFS approach was not being very effective with her. I mean, suggesting that she get out of her little world and take a vacation and go somewhere else. That's cognitive behavior therapy, right? That's much different. Well, because why? Partly because just doing it less, for whatever reason, any reason at all, just doing it less makes the drive less intense.
Yes, which is that's our concept of abstinence.
Right.
Yeah.
So that of course it can't be abstinent with food, but you can certainly change the habit, the pattern.
Yeah.
So, whatever works in that case, it's just try to, try to interfere with it, try to obstruct it, try to, wall it off. Okay, and that you and I would agree.
Walling it off, exactly, which is like the treatment center, but not anyway. Okay, now let's just, because we have to close off here now. With your discussion, maybe not so much now because it sounds like you're not sort of in the public foray at this point. Have you had any pushback, or what's been the general response to your ideas, especially from the traditional medical model world? Have you been? I mean, your books have been. I don't know if they're truly bestsellers, but they are staples.
Yeah, they have sold well. And
they have sold well. I mean, everybody knows them. I just mentioned your name in class, and somebody will be nodding. Yeah, so they've at least read The Biology of Desire. That's a big one. The other one's big too.
Yeah, no, I'm proud of that. And and they've been translated into quite a few languages. They're now audiobooks and stuff. So I did get pushback because I was on these, interviews and podcasts and stuff. And from the world of NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, some people were really mad at me. Like, what's his name? The alcohol guy. We had this debate on CBC, and he was yelling at me. He said, I've had 5 friends die from alcoholism, and you have the audacity to say that's not a disease?
Yeah, right. It's like a disease model thing. Yeah.
So that's one side of it. And the other side, though, was like a lot of people felt this is very important. I never felt it was a disease. That never made sense to me. Thinking about the psychological... At that time, I wasn't into IFS. That was before I got into it.
Yeah.
But I was talking about the psychology, what's going on in there. And for a lot of people found that really useful. And so it was a very bifurcated response. Some people liked my stuff. Some people hated it. Right.
Okay. All right.
And when you get to stuff like the opioid crisis, especially in the U.S., but here too, it's like, people would come and say, well, we need to get these people, we need to get them Suboxone and methadone, and we do off the street and needle exchanges and stuff. And how are you going to help that by saying it's not a disease? It won't even be covered by insurance if it's not a disease.
Ah, that's a good point.
Right. So so I'll say, okay, that's a political, social issue, legal issue. It's not a scientific issue. I can't.
That relates to the food thing too. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, you use it that way if it helps, but I can't back it as someone who's thinking scientifically.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So now what is next for you, Marc? You kind of alluded to another book. Are you willing to say more about it, or do you need to put that on you want to wait?
It's, the publishing world is very challenging, quite difficult to get things out there. But I hope this will get picked up. I've spent a long time thinking about it and putting together a few chapters. And it's really, IFS, Internal Family Systems, is the last in a long line of models that look at the personality as made up of different components. Like I was saying, like Gestalt was like a 1970s start, right? Yes, for pearls. The two chair technique. You can sit in one chair and say, you're an nasty piece of shit. And then you go to the other chair and you say, I'm sorry.
Right. I remember I did that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, me too, a little. Anyway, but so it goes all the way back. It goes back to Freud and, the id, ego, superego. And so in my book, I want to say this modularity of mind, this modular personality, I want to take it to the neural level as much as possible and say what's going on inside what's a scientific, because everyone has covered this stuff in terms of metaphor.
Yes.
And IFS also uses metaphors, the internal parts, the protectors and the exiles. Okay. So my question is, what happens? Can we get beyond the metaphors and get to an actual, more scientific understanding here?
That would be fascinating. And I can just imagine that you would do such a good job because you'd have a story about each of these parts. Like, that's fascinating. Okay, so we have one more question. It's our final signature question. And that is, Marc, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about addiction, probably not food addiction, just addiction in general, what would it be?
Well, one thing that's been very interesting for me is that my suffering as someone with an addiction problem has also led to a kind of knowledge and compassion and understanding for people that really feeds me as a psychotherapist. And not only someone working with addictions, but just understanding suffering and isolation and loneliness and shame. It's been a double-edged sword. I paid for it, but it's really helped me become a bigger, more comprehensive, more generous person. So that was kind of good. Okay. So you probably would say something like, "You're good." Yeah, I'm good now. I'm pretty good, and I'm pretty old. It's been a long life, and it's fine. But I'm healthy, and I guess I would say to myself, "Hey, guy, you're gonna make it. It's okay. You're gonna hurt. It's gonna be a lot of bruises, but you're gonna come out the other side. You're gonna be in good shape." And
you're gonna be in a wonderful office in Toronto helping other people. Yeah. Okay. For our listeners, again, that was Marc Lewis, and his two books are a must-read. If you haven't read them, I'm sure you have. Read them again. They're fabulous books. Memoirs of an Addicted Brain and Biology of Desire, and hopefully soon to come another book. Thank you so much, Marc, for spending time with us.
Thanks, Fred. It's a pleasure talking with you, always.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.